Just over 10 years ago now, I switched over to Sony mirrorless cameras. And so I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk just about what that switch has meant to me and some of the innovations and things that have taken place over the last 10 years with Sony cameras. Now, I started shooting Canon. I originally was on Canon DSLRs. My first pro level DSLR camera was the Canon 5D Mark II. Previous to that, my first DSLR was the Canon 20D. And I was heavily integrated into the Canon DSLR world with lots of lenses and camera bodies at that time. But the problem that I faced at pretty much every wedding that I was shooting, because I was shooting a lot of weddings during those years, was low light performance. That seemed to be my biggest issue. And so when Sony released the A7S, I was probably one of the first in line to purchase it because all of the hype and the talk about it being a low light performance king was definitely what I needed in my life, shooting in a lot of low light situations with weddings. And so I ended up making that switch, purchasing one of those cameras, thinking this will be my low light camera and I will shoot everything else on my Canon. Then it wasn't too long before I started buying whatever lenses were available at the time for Sony full frame mount on the E-mount. And then from there, it just progressed until I finally decided I can live on this platform, even though there aren't a whole lot of lenses yet, and get rid of all of my DSLR equipment. Now, early on, this was kind of a controversial switch. Many people at the beginning thought that mirrorless was going to be a fad, that this mirrorless camera, small, compact camera movement wasn't going to overtake DSLR. And here we are more than 10 years now later since the first A7 camera released, and DSLRs are a thing of the past. Yes, you can still buy a few DSLRs, but they're just not in production and definitely not in demand. And the technology has come so far with our mirrorless cameras that there's no argument to be made anymore for a reason to shoot DSLR and choose that over mirrorless. There's still great DSLR cameras out there, and even some of the cameras that came out many, many years ago are amazing cameras that capture fantastic photos. But when it comes to some of the newer technologies that are in these mirrorless cameras, DSLRs just really can't hang with all the performance that we get out of these. So some of the skepticism, I think that is all past. And we've seen a lot of, especially YouTubers, and I know there are a lot of other photographers and people who shoot video as well, who have made the switch from a DSLR and switched over to Sony. Now, at that time, when the mirrorless cameras were coming out, Canon had nothing to offer, nor did Nikon. And it took a little bit of time before Canon finally stepped up and offered something as far as mirrorless go. Now, I got my hands on that first mirrorless full-frame camera that Canon came out with, and it was not that great. Canon definitely stumbled for a little bit with a few iterations of cameras before they really got some momentum going and came out with some fantastic products. And now I'd say Canon is probably one of the best as well when it comes to mirrorless cameras. Their cameras are absolutely fantastic. I've spent a lot of time with them, even have a few courses on how to utilize some of the Canon mirrorless cameras. And I even spent some time with Nikon as well, thinking maybe Nikon is a contender here. I never put all of my eggs in the Sony basket and said, okay, Sony is the only way to go, because I know that both Canon and Nikon are fantastic camera manufacturers as well, and that they would eventually figure it out. Nikon definitely had some really cool stuff coming out, and their cameras are great, but I have chosen Sony and I've stuck with Sony, and there's no reason for me to switch to Canon or Nikon, even when there are some new little bells and whistles from time to time that get kind of exciting. So some of the early challenges that I faced when I was shooting Sony was a lack of lens support. There just was not many lenses. A lot of the full frame lenses were their E-series lenses, which means a 70-200 had an f4 aperture, not an f2.8. So a lot of the lenses just weren't very fast. But with the low light performance, I was getting better performance out of a 70-200 f4 than I was getting out of a 70-200 f2.8 on my Canon DSLR. And that's when I really decided to make the switch, was when, even though I didn't have super fast lenses for Sony, and adapting my Canon lenses to the Sony was not in the question. The performance just wasn't there. I believed that lenses were going to come, and so I just decided to get rid of all of my Canon equipment and start investing in Sony, and thus kicked off what is now 10 years of being a Sony shooter. And of course now, 10 years later, we're having second iterations of lenses come out, like this 24 to 70 millimeter G Master is in its second series. There are several lenses in the G Master line which are the best, some of the best lenses in the world, that are in their second iteration now. So let's take a quick trip down memory lane and take a look at some of the innovations that Sony's had over the last decade. Well, in 2013, they released the first A7 camera. The A7S didn't get released until a little bit later that year, didn't start shipping until 2014. That's when I got mine, was in 2014. Now we're in 2024, going into 2025. Hence the 10-year time that I've been a Sony shooter. So when Sony kicked off that A7S camera, that is the one that really got all of the attention because it performed so well in low light. People were not expecting it. People were apprehensive and skeptics, and there was a lot of skepticism flying, but me, I was using it in weddings and shooting all sorts of stuff, even though it was a little bit lower of a resolution camera, only I think like 12.2 or 12.4 megapixels at the time. That is all that I needed, especially when I had the capabilities of shooting in really dark situations with the A7S. In 2015, the A7R II came out, which was a 42.4 megapixel back illuminated sensor, and that really started to show people that you could take higher resolution images with a Sony mirrorless camera. And that became the first Sony camera that I bought that I was really excited to use for photography. Of course, I'd been using my A7S for a while, but the lower resolution meant that I couldn't rely on that camera all the time when I needed more resolution. And then 2017 came along with the A9, and that is when I think the final nail was put in the coffin for DSLR. Now, one of the things that was a struggle of shooting mirrorless back in the day was that whenever you press down the shutter button, your screen would go black and you wouldn't see anything until the camera was ready to take the next photo. And with DSLR, you can look through the viewfinder and you could just continuously see. There was nothing obstructing your view. So if you were following a fast-moving subject with a DSLR, you're not going to lose that subject. But with the Sony cameras or with mirrorless cameras back in the day, if you're following a subject, your screen is blacking out and you might lose track or lose framing of that subject and mess up an opportunity to get a good shot. But when the A9 came out, we got zero blackout. And that meant that we can hold down that shutter button and fire off a whole bunch of photos. The A9 was also extremely fast in continuous shooting, but we also didn't have any blackout at all, which meant shooting action, we weren't going to lose our subject, we can maintain good framing and good autofocus throughout. And also at that time, Sony cameras had started to get a little bit bigger. They weren't as small as the original A7S that I had. They were a little bit better ergonomically, easier to hold on to for longer periods of time. But then in 2020, Sony shrinks it up again and puts a full frame camera into what we were used to seeing in an APS-C size body with the Sony A7C. The Sony A7C became the perfect travel grab-and-go camera for me because I can use my full frame lenses on it. It was a full frame camera. It was fantastic in low light. It was a nice fast camera, but it was smaller and compact and easier to stow away. Then in 2021, we were graced with the Sony A1, which has become my primary workhorse camera since that day. This absolutely fantastic camera that shoots 50 megapixel images and can even shoot 8K video is the camera that I take on every shoot and the camera that I rely on for pretty much everything. This camera is a beast, and although there are other camera manufacturers making decent cameras, the A1 is hard to be measured up against because it's just been so good. And of course now in 2024, we have the Sony A1 Mark II that I am hoping to receive within the next couple of weeks at the time of recording this. And of course, we'll be back to report my findings on how that camera performs over my original A1. And then in 2022, just a couple of years ago, Sony started throwing AI into the mix with the Sony A7 IV having AI processing chip to assist with autofocusing. And that is only the beginning of what we're starting to see in some amazing autofocus technologies for subject tracking, regardless of the species, and many more things are to come. And some of those improvements I rely on daily when I'm using my cameras. First of all, autofocus is so good, I couldn't even imagine what autofocus would be like today, 10 years ago when I first started out with the Sony a7S, or even prior to that when I was shooting DSLR. I really had to be vigilant with autofocus, and I spent more time thinking about and considering my focus than I did my framing and my composition, because it was such a challenge back in the day. But these days, autofocus has gotten so good, I can't completely forget about it and rely on the camera for everything, but I think about it so much less, which allows more of my mental bandwidth to focus on composition, framing, and all the things that make for a good photo. The low light performance continues to improve, although I don't think it's improved substantially over the last several years. It's still really good, and I don't consider low light to be nearly an issue anymore. I know that with my cameras, I can boost them up to the point where they almost see in the dark. Or even with a simple light, I could bring enough light into a situation to get a nice clean image. Low light is not something that I have to constantly battle like it was 10 years ago before switching over to the Sony a7S. And then of course the video capabilities on these cameras just continue to get better and better also. They shoot fantastic video, but with that autofocus tracking, I'm able to rely on utilizing autofocus to maintain focus on my subject and not have to rely on manual focus or even including somebody else to make sure that focus is maintained. Where I used to struggle in being a solo camera operator, I don't struggle nearly as hard anymore because these cameras are so good. So before we talk about the current state of Sony and kind of what I'm thinking about in the future, let's just take a look at some images that I've shot here just to give some examples. I mean, I shoot a variety of different things. Sometimes it's as simple as shooting a YouTube thumbnail. Other times I'm shooting content for a client. Sometimes I'm out shooting landscapes for fun and enjoyment. Other times more YouTube thumbnails, photos of my dog, photos of products, different things that are taking place. I mean, a lot of images. Here's one from a wedding. Lots of different environments that I find myself in, and even getting a self-portrait of my family at a wedding. Shooting the Northern Lights up here in Montana. Shooting my kids' sports teams. Shooting more thumbnails, shooting some portraits in a gym, photos of vehicles and stuff like that. I mean, all of the, here's a super low light situation that I would not have been able to get anywhere near if I was still shooting on DSLR. Shooting a lot of real estate photography, lots of landscapes. There are just so many opportunities that I have with the camera to shoot so many different things. And the improvements of the Sony cameras over the years has allowed me to focus less on the camera and making sure that the camera does what I want it to do, because the camera these days does what I want it to do. I don't have to think about it so much. I can focus on my composition, on getting the shot that I want, and focus less on trying to make the camera or force the camera to work in a situation or an environment. So just tons of different photos over the years, different scenarios that I found myself in shooting on Sony. And without the Sony camera, a lot of these images would have been much more challenging. So where do I see the current state of Sony Mirrorless? Well, I think we're in a season right now where there's more software innovation taking place than there is hardware innovation. Looking at the Sony A1 and the new Sony A2, I would have thought there would be massive hardware upgrades and stuff like that, but it's going to come with the same sensor that the A1 came with, which was kind of confusing at first. But there's better processing that's going to be included. There's new AI features coming to the A1. There's also additional software features that are being built in as well. And so all of that is going to provide a much better experience than this camera, even though it's several years old. Software requires more robust hardware in order for it to run. Sensor technology is maybe at a stagnation right now, or it's good enough that we don't necessarily need anything else yet. We need the software and the processing to catch up with the sensor technology. And so I think that's kind of where we're at. We're not going to maybe see for a few more years any major developments in sensor technology, because the images that we're able to get are so clear and so good. What we need is processing technology that can help maximize the sensor technology that's already in these cameras. Looking to the future, I am excited to see what AI is able to do in these cameras. Now, I don't necessarily want a camera that can take a picture for me, maybe identify when everything is perfect and hit that shutter button. I want to be connected to my images. I don't want a camera that does everything for me. But I do want a camera that identifies things like autofocus and subject tracking and is able to do a better job at track a subject. There are things that are challenging that take a lot of mental bandwidth away from a photographer or someone running a camera for video, a video creator, and makes them focus on things that they don't want to be focusing on. You want to focus on composition and storytelling and all of those good creative aspects. You don't want to have to be thinking about your equipment. And so as more technology comes in, AI features and stuff like that, I hope that that just empowers us to be better storytellers, better content creators, and spend less time on the technical, because really our technology should get out of our way. I think about that with my tablet and with my phone. These technologies should get out of my way and allow me to be more productive and more creative. So 10 years later, I am so happy that I made the switch when I did to Sony. I feel like I was maybe one of those early adopters of mirrorless technology and struggled a little bit with some of the things that mirrorless didn't have back in the day. I'm glad that everybody else saw what mirrorless was bringing to the table as well, so that it could become the platform that it has become today. Now, if you are relatively new to Sony cameras, mirrorless cameras, or photography in general, I have a few different courses that you might find interesting. First of all, my Ditch Auto course will help you get out of automatic mode and learn how to control your camera by understanding the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO of your camera, composition, and how to use all of those things together. I also have some camera specific courses, so if you have a specific Sony camera, I may have a course just for you to help you fully understand and learn everything that there is to know about that camera. So check out the links down in the description below. I don't know about you, but I'm excited to see where photography is going as hardware is improving and software is improving, and we're getting new features that help us become better content creators. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section below. Did you switch over to Sony or mirrorless? When was that? And what were you shooting on before? I'd love to hear about it, so let's talk about it down there. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. We'll see you back in another one soon. Take care.